This is the third test review for Philosophy 110P for Old Dominion University, and it covers the readings from Benedict through Ewing. Now, I've also sent you students kind of a written summary of class lectures, so I encourage you to study those summaries very closely and to create flashcards so that you're able to recall key information. Ideally, people should be doing the readings. They should be carefully studying the lecture notes, and they should also, of course, very carefully study this this video lecture, which of course you can see repeatedly because I am linking this for you to YouTube, and it'll be connected, as I say, to YouTube, and you can look at it repeatedly. So let's go to the third test review. Now, as usual, the test will be 20 questions, and it's going to be objective, things like multiple choice, true, false. And let's go over the content. Okay, first you need to know something about Ruth Benedict. Ruth Benedict was an anthropologist. Ruth Benedict argued in favor of cultural relativism. Now, what is cultural relativism? Well, it's a theory stating that standards of morality, standards of normality, standards of rationality or reasonableness, and standards of beauty are created by, dependent on, and relative to each culture. So the question is, does Benedict or did Benedict believe that normality is defined predominantly by culture? And if the answer is yes, in fact, she would say that's true not only of normality, that it's culturally defined and it can vary from one culture to another, but that's also true about morality. According to Benedict, at least when she published this article in favor of cultural relativism, standards of right and wrong are purely determined by each culture, so that some practice can be right in one culture while being wrong in another. Not just considered right in one culture and considered wrong in another, but actually be right in one culture and be wrong in another because of different cultural norms. Now, I also want you to know about W.T. Stace. W.T. Stace criticized cultural relativism, and especially its ethical component. Because remember, I said that cultural relativism has an ethical component. It says standards of morality are dependent on culture. It also has a normality component. It says standards of normality are dependent on culture. Standards of rationality and standards of beauty are dependent on culture. So W.T. Stace focused especially on criticizing the ethical dimension of cultural relativism. Now the question is, how did Stace distinguish cultural relativism from a recognition of different moral beliefs in different cultures? Well, as Stace points out, cultural relativism doesn't simply say that one culture can have different practices and different moral beliefs from those of another. In fact, that's not controversial at all. It's not controversial at all to say that historically Ireland has disapproved of marital divorce when other cultures have approved of it. That's not really controversial. It really isn't. It's not controversial to say that the Amish have some different moral practices from our general American society. That's not controversial. But in any event, what is controversial, however, is the claim by cultural relativists that cultural approval alone can make a practice right, and cultural disapproval alone can make a practice wrong. Okay? So notice what Stace is saying, because Stace is accurately depicting what is implied by cultural relativism. Cultural relativism is saying that wherever, let's say, slavery is generally approved of by the majority of a society and institutionalized in laws and customs, that slavery is right. Not simply that it's considered right, but that it is right. Now that has very interesting implications because it looks as if that implies that in Nazi Germany, if it's true that the majority approved of enslaving and committing genocide against millions of peaceful people who belong to various minorities, you see, if that in fact is true, that in fact Germany institutionalized prejudice and slavery against particular groups and even genocide. If that's correct, and if culturalism says that whatever the majority generally approves of will automatically be right in a culture, that would seem to imply that genocide was right in Nazi Germany. Not simply considered right, but actually was right, simply because it was generally approved. Okay? And Stace, of course, criticizes cultural relativism for having that implication. So remember, Stace is saying that cultural relativism isn't simply saying that some country may have, let's say, let's say slavery, and another country may not have it and disapprove of it. What he's saying is this. He's saying, according to cultural relativism, now remember, he's criticizing cultural relativism. Benedict was defending it. Stace is criticizing it. Stace is saying, according to cultural relativism, whatever is generally approved of in a culture at a particular time, in a particular place, will automatically be right, regardless of whether that practice clearly violates the golden rule, regardless of whether that practice embodies prejudice against minorities. It doesn't really matter. According to cultural relativism, simply getting the majority's approval will make something right in a particular culture. And Stace, of course, is rejecting cultural relativism largely because of that implication. Now, whether Stace thinks that ethical relativists can believe in moral progress, well, the answer is no. See, Stace thinks that if you are an ethical relativist, and again, remember, cultural relativism includes a form of ethical relativism, and you're an ethical relativist whenever you say that standards of right and wrong depend on either the opinions and practices of a group or the opinions of some individual. In other words, instead of saying something's right because of its nature or it's right because of its consequences, if you simply say, well, it's right according to a particular point of view, and okay, that's a form of ethical relativism. And Stace is criticizing that, okay? So then the question becomes, does Stace believe that ethical relativists can believe in moral progress? And the answer is no. In fact, that's one of the bases on which he criticizes the theory. Stace says he thinks it makes sense for people to believe in the possibility of not just moral change, but moral progress. Now, what would be an example of that? Okay. Well, a lot of people would say that the vast majority of the world doesn't have straightforward slavery and the vast majority of the world got rid of it, that was not only moral change, but it was moral progress. Or let's take another example. For thousands of years, people defined right and wrong according to a purely tribal morality. Okay? In other words, it was considered wrong for members of some tribe to sell spoiled meat to other members, but quite permissible to sell spoiled meat to people who are not members of the tribe. Okay? That was thousands of years ago, but increasingly more and more people, including people we call prophets today and also philosophers, came to say that everybody counts morally, not just members of one's tribe. Within religious context, people were saying, and you can include Jesus in this, that everyone is your neighbor, not simply people who look like you, have your same religion, who live next to you, but every human being is your neighbor and worthy of your moral concern. Okay? So to the extent that people came increasingly to believe that everybody counts morally and not just members of one's own tribe, there are many people who would argue that's not simply moral change, that is moral progress. That's an expansion of the moral imagination. So the short answer to whether Stace believes that ethical relativists can believe in moral progress is no, he doesn't. Now, the other thing is, does Stace believe that diversity of moral opinion proves or in any way substantiates ethical relativism? The short answer to this is no. Now let me explain. First of all, Stace criticizes ethical relativism, so he's not going to think anything proves it. Okay, that's number one. Number two, Stace says that people can have different opinions, even over things that are straightforwardly factual. For example, the shape of the Earth. There have been cultures that have believed where most people believe that the Earth was flat and certainly wasn't spherical. Now, according to Stace, says just because people disagree, even if lots of people disagree over something, doesn't mean there's not an objectively correct answer. So Stace says the mere fact that people can disagree in some cases over what is right and what is wrong will not, in and of itself, show that ethical relativism is correct. Okay, remember, Stace's position is that there are certain things that are wrong, objectively wrong, such as the Nazis murdering Jewish people and gypsies, that these things were just plain wrong and they can't be made right simply through cultural approval. Okay, that's his position. And his position, furthermore, is that the mere fact that people disagree at times over what is right or what is wrong doesn't mean that somebody's not right or closer to being right. So he doesn't think the diversity of moral opinion proves ethical relativism. Why does he call ethical relativism defeatism in morals? We're talking about Stace, who's a critic of ethical relativism. I think the short answer is that Stace believes, as I've indicated in these lecture notes, that ethical relativism is defeatism in morals because it gives up on the possibility in believing in real moral progress rather than mere moral change, and believing in real moral wisdom rather than simply beliefs that are popular at a given place and time. See? Now, the idea of moral progress suggests the possibility, at least, that certain moral practices could be objectively superior to others. And the idea of moral wisdom normally includes the idea that some individual could be wiser than the multitudes. In the past, we've talked about the prophets, like the prophets of what people say the Old Testament or the Hebrew Scriptures. They would at times condemn popular practices and say, well, these are popular, but it doesn't make them right. In the Bible, for example, in the Old Testament or Hebrew Scriptures, it says, for example, thou shalt not suffer a multitude to do evil. So the mere fact that some practice is popular, according to many people who believe in the possibility of genuine moral wisdom, will not automatically guarantee that the practice is wise or right. Okay, so Stace thinks that if somebody's a thoroughgoing ethical relativist, the person really doesn't believe in the possibility of genuine moral progress rather than moral change, or genuine moral wisdom rather than simply popular opinion. See? I mean, think about, for example, Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr. went against predominant beliefs, customs, and laws, especially in the South. We're talking about the South in the United States, of course, and we're talking about Jim Crow laws, racial segregation laws that treated millions of people as second-class citizens. And what did Martin Luther King say? He said these things are just plain wrong. These laws are wrong. That people are human beings. They all matter. And within the idiom of religion, he says we're all children of God. We all matter, and these laws are wrong. Racial segregation laws. They even go against the whole idea of the value of individuals, according to the Declaration of Independence, that everyone is created, whether some people say nature or by God, but has value, that has dignity, has rights. But in any event, I think those are some of the key reasons that Stace calls ethical relativism, defeatism in morals. I want to talk a bit about Harry Browne. How does Harry Browne ends up dividing moral codes into three different sorts? One is personal morality, which he approves of. And what does personal morality say? Personal morality says that people should aim at their own personally defined happiness, and that no one can define happiness for you. And within broad limits, people should be given the latitude, the right, if you like, the freedom, if you like, to pursue their personally defined happiness. Okay. Now, Now, but within broad latitude, they're not allowed to violate people's rights to become serial killers, to rob people. They need to respect people's individual rights, but within broad limits, he says people should be allowed to define and pursue their own personally defined happiness. Now, that's personal morality. How does he define absolute morality? Well, absolute morality, according to Brown, says that all people should follow the same moral code, the same specific rules, even when those rules require self-sacrifice, sacrificing one's happiness or perhaps even one's life. Now, of course, he doesn't approve of that. He doesn't approve of absolute immorality in that sense, because he thinks that the purpose of morality is to allow people to pursue their own personally defined happiness. He also talks about universal morality, which he also disapproves of. Now, universal morality says, yes, we should pursue our personally defined, well, no, take that back. It says we should pursue personal happiness. But the difference is that universal morality, according to Brown, says that there is one road to happiness. There is one set of specific ways to live and specific rules that everyone must follow. And Brown says that people are just too different as individuals for there to be one highly specific way to live, one highly specific blueprint for happiness. And so he believes that what he calls universal morality is just unrealistic. Okay, so I want you to know that Brown agrees with personal morality, which, by the way, professional philosophers call ethical or rational egoism. And this is kind of a little tricky because they would call it ethical or rational egoism of the universal or impersonal sort. So you've got the word universal used differently from the way Brown is using it when he talks about universal morality. But the key thing you need to understand is that Brown's personal morality says that all people should define their personal happiness and pursue it, and that his way of thinking, Brown's way of thinking, is very much like that of Ayn Rand, the philosopher, who did believe in universal, impersonal, ethical, or rational egoism. Now, what does Harry Brown think of the idea that personal sacrifices are necessary? Okay. Well, Harry Brown believes that we shouldn't be engaging in personal sacrifices. And he believes that, now let's be clear, by personal sacrifices he means the idea that someone would give up on the idea of personal happiness and somehow, in a sense, be a victim for someone else's sake. Brown believes that we should not be victimizers nor victims. Brown believes that we can pursue our own happiness in cooperation with other people and create win-win situations. Now, does that mean that people, if they become parents, they shouldn't, in a sense, look after their children and often do things that are inconvenient for themselves for their children's sake? No. Brown thinks that if someone is a parent, the person has obligations, legal and moral obligations, to take care of his or her children. But his view is, to the degree that people are rational and they choose to become parents, then they should realize that being parents will carry with it obligations to take care of one's children. Okay, so Brown does not think personal sacrifices are necessary either for a sound morality or for one's own personal happiness. Okay, so now the other thing that you need to know about Brown is you need to know what does he think of the idea that unselfishness is beneficial. Now remember, for Brown, the idea of unselfishness means self-sacrifice, and it means sacrificing one's ultimate happiness. And he doesn't think that he doesn't put that at the center of morality. In fact, again, he believes that unselfishness is not mutually beneficial. In other words, he doesn't think it makes sense for people to constantly put others ahead of themselves. He thinks we need to cooperate with one another for mutual benefit. He believed that the center of morality should be the individual pursuit of happiness and rational mutual cooperation. And he believed that the people who are teaching us constantly to sacrifice our own happiness for what they consider the collective good or for some other ideal, according to him, they produce a lot of misery. whether it was the former Soviet Union, which called for self-sacrifice, or Nazi Germany, which called for self-sacrifice. And you need to know that, according to Brown, most of our interactions with other people are successful and they're mutually beneficial. Whether we're trading value for value, as when we go out and buy something for money, trade money for some good or service, or whether we get together with friends and study and have a meal. And generally speaking, he thinks that most of our interactions are in fact mutually beneficial, and that's the way they ought to be. You just need to know that fact. You also need to know a good deal about James Rachels. And okay, does Rachels believe that some actions can be both selfish and morally neutral? No. According to Rachels, if some action is selfish, that means that it's mistreating others. It's either acting in such a way that you're clearly harming others for your own benefit, or you're improperly ignoring others when you shouldn't. As when, let's say, somebody's drowning in front of you and you can easily throw a rope or some flotation device and you ignore the person. Suppose you're eating a chalupa and it's nice and warm and you're on a pier, and then somebody's drowning in front of you and says, please, please help me. And you can throw a flotation device, but you said, no, I can't help you because I'm eating this warm chalupa. I don't want it to get cold. Okay, now that would be selfish according to Rachels. Now then the question is, does Rachels think that selfish activity can be morally neutral? And the short answer is no. To call something selfish, properly speaking, according to Rachels, is to criticize it. And it's to suggest, if not to imply, that it involves mistreating other people. Now you might ask, well, what it would be morally neutral then? Well, let's just say this. Self-interested behavior could be morally neutral or even beneficial. Tying your shoelaces when they're untied or when they come untied could be morally neutral. Doesn't mean it's selfish in the sense of unreasonably harming others. So the short answer is no. Rachels doesn't think that an action can be both selfish and morally neutral. How does he distinguish psychological from ethical egoism? Psychological egoism, as I note in the lecture notes, is a descriptive theory saying that all people always do what they believe is in their self-interest. Okay? Ethical or rational egoism is a normative or prescriptive theory setting up a standard or recommending behavior, and it can be divided into impersonal or universal egoism, impersonal egoism. So remember, psychological egoism doesn't recommend behavior. It purports to describe how people actually think and behave. And it says people are always after their own good. They always want to give up less than they can get. They're always self-centered, in some way. Okay, that's descriptive, that theory. That we're talking about psychological egoism. But ethical or rational egoism is setting up a standard of how people should behave. It's recommending behavior. It talks about what should be instead of purporting to talk about what is. Okay, so let's talk about impersonal or universal ethical or rational egoism. That was accepted by Harry Browne and Ayn Rand. And that says that all people should, note the word should, you could say should, you could say ought to, promote their enlightened self-interest or long-term happiness. Okay, so that's what that says. Think of, again, the position that all people should pursue their enlightened self-interest or long-term happiness. That is an example of what you'd call impersonal or universal ethical or rational egoism. Ayn Rand favored that theory, but so did Harry Browne. Now, there's also something called personal ethical egoism. Let's say that Popeye is a personal ethical egoist. That means that Popeye believes that he should promote his self-interest, but he doesn't think that other people should promote their self-interest. In fact, he'd prefer that they promote his self-interest. So Popeye then, if he were a personal ethical egoist, again, believes that he should promote his self-interest. He doesn't believe that all of us should promote our self-interest. And so, therefore, you could say that Popeye, if he believed that, is being a personal ethical egoist, but not a universal or impersonal one. Why? Because an impersonal ethical egoist believes that all people should promote their enlightened self-interest. And again, that's a position of Harry Browne. That's a position of also Ayn Rand. Now, whether Rachel thinks that ethical egoism is logically inconsistent. Well, the short answer to this is, well, whether Rachel's thinks that ethical egoism is logically inconsistent. Well, Rachel's believes that the universal or impersonal form of it will lead to inconsistencies in practice or practical inconsistencies whenever two or more people are interacting and and the theory cannot resolve that conflict when you have two or more people not only interacting but interacting with conflicting interests. According to as I say, to Rachel's, you cannot really that can't be resolved. See, in other words, think of it this way: suppose it is in someone's self-interest to let's say defraud somebody of money, but it's not in someone else's self-interest to be defrauded. Okay, so whose interest should prevail when they interact? According to Rachel's, a sound morality should help us arbitrate between and among conflicting interests. But Rachel says impersonal or universal ethical egoism says everybody should constantly promote their own self-interest. But he goes, well, what happens when you got two or more people interacting and and it's in one person's self-interest to do something that will frustrate the self-interest of the other? Whose interest should prevail? And according to Rachel's, the theory can't tell us. Okay? Now, Ayn Rand believed that it could, because she believed that you could have a very specific idea of individual rights to life, liberty, and property, and you could have competition but also cooperation, as we do in competitive sports. I don't want to go into that, but I do want you to know that Rachel's believed that universal or impersonal ethical/rational egoism would lead to practical inconsistencies whenever two or more people interact with conflicting interests. I want you to know that. Now, as to the personal form of ethical egoism, Rachel's criticized it, but not because he thought there was anything about it that was inconsistent or that would lead to inconsistencies. Okay? So remember, let's suppose that Popeye, again, is a personal ethical egoist. That means Popeye believes that Popeye, should always pursue his enlightened self-interest. Okay? Now, according to Rachel's, that is not a position that is in any way inconsistent. You could always have some given number of people who individually always pursue their self-interest. Okay? And they could even get away with that and do that. Rachel's has a problem with that, morally speaking, however. Because Rachel says that if someone wants always to pursue his or her self-interest, regardless of the consequences of others, the person could end up mistreating others simply for the person's own benefit. Okay? So what I want to tell you is Rachel's criticizes all forms of egoism. He says psychological egoism, again, which is a descriptive theory. He says that's a false universal generalization, because sometimes people do what they think is right, even though they have to sacrifice their interests. Second, Rachel's criticizes, as we've seen, universal ethical egoism because he believes that it can lead to practical inconsistencies whenever two or more persons interact with conflicting interests. And third, he criticizes personal ethical egoism, not because he thinks there's anything self-contradictory in it, but because he thinks that it could lead some individuals to mistreat others simply for their own benefit. So he criticizes personal ethical egoism on moral grounds as being morally unacceptable. Now, what does Rachel's think about the idea of getting pleasure from helping others? Does that show selfishness? No. Rachel says that you're selfish when you're doing what you want, okay, while unacceptably ignoring or violating other people's interests. Okay? So the mere fact that you get pleasure from helping others doesn't in any way show that you are selfish, according to Rachel's. In fact, Rachel says if you really care about other people, presumably you will get pleasure from helping them because you'll be fulfilling your values. Okay, now, does Rachel believe that ethical egoists will want to publicize and encourage their position? The answer is going to be no. Remember, first of all, that Rachel says that the only consistent form of ethical egoism will be the personal form of it. And if you're a personal ethical egoist, Rachel says you're going to want to pretend that you're not. Now, why is that? Well, Rachel says if you're always thinking in a self-centered way, you're going to don't want people to know that, because you're going to want people to cooperate with you and trust you. And many people are not going to trust you if they know that you're always out for yourself. So Rachel says, if you're a personal ethical egoist, you're not going to want to encourage other people to think the way you do, nor are you going to want other people to know how you think. You're going to have to pretend not to be a personal ethical egoist. He says you could do this, but Rachel thinks it requires a certain degree, of course, of deception. Moreover, Rachel believes that personal ethical egoism could lead someone seriously to mistreat other people simply for his or her own benefit. And so therefore, Rachel thinks that most people don't have the stomach or the conscience always to act egoistically, so that most people, if they really understood the consequences of personal ethical egoism, would not want to always to be personal ethical egoists. By the way, he thinks that you would have to have a really, shall we say, you'd have to have virtually no conscience at all, according to Rachel's, if you're going to always act egoistically, regardless of the effects on others. Okay, now, does Rachel's believe that some actions are done neither from enlightened self-interest nor from a concern for others? Yes, and these would be actions that would be self-destructive. They would be actions that would be maybe impulsive actions that were self-destructive, so that people, for example, would get very angry. They'd beat up their bosses even though they desperately need the jobs. Or young guys want to see how much Wild Turkey bourbon they can drink within a half hour, and they can get sick, and some people even can die of alcohol poisoning. Normally, that's not activity that is in someone's enlightened self-interest, nor is it normally done out of concern for others. Now, the other thing is, why doesn't Rachel think that the Abe Lincoln example fortifies or strengthens psychological egoism? Rachel thinks that Lincoln's helping the pigs didn't show that he was purely self-interested, but showed that he was concerned about something outside himself. Remember that Lincoln said if he didn't help the pigs, he would feel bad. Well, if he were thoroughly self-interested and all he cared about himself, why would he feel bad if he didn't help the pigs? Now, does Rachel's believe that an act's harmfulness gives us a moral reason to avoid it? Yes. In fact, generally, most ethical theories, if not all of them, hold that an act's harmfulness gives us a reason to avoid it. In other words, if you're driving your car and there's some kids about to go through the crosswalk, you have, if you could run them over if you didn't stop, then you'd have a moral reason to stop. Now, Rachel thinks that an ethical egoist can't acknowledge that. And again, that means that Rachel doesn't believe that ethical egoists can believe in individual moral rights. And I don't want to go into that right now, but anyway, you need to know that Rachel believes that an act's harmfulness gives us a moral reason to avoid it. I want to talk about E. Daniel Kay. E. Daniel Kay was or has been a utilitarian. He's defending a form of utilitarianism which is known as classical utilitarianism. And there were a number of people who held it, but the two most famous people to hold it in the 19th century were actually Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, both English people. Now, all you need to know is that E. Daniel Kay defends utilitarianism, and therefore he defines moral rightness according to beneficial consequences, because all forms of utilitarianism do that. All forms of utilitarianism actually define moral duties according to maximizing good consequences. And you also need to know that E. Daniel Kay believed that there's only one completely correct ethical theory, and that is utilitarianism. Okay, so you need to know that as well. Both of those things, propositions, are of course listed on your review sheet. Now, the last thing you need to know for the third test is you need to know A.C. Ewing. A.C. Ewing was a guy who was popular as a philosopher in the 20th century. He wrote about ethics. He wrote about some other things as well, but he was well known for writing about ethics. Ewing spends most of his essay, now remember, his essay is called A Critique of Utilitarianism. Not surprisingly, he spends most of it criticizing utilitarianism. Notice also that the criticism, he's talking about classical utilitarianism. And what is classical utilitarianism? It's a form of utilitarianism that says principally two things. It says first that pleasure is the only thing intrinsically good, that is to say, good in and of itself. And second, it says that we should maximize pleasure minus the net pleasure. In other words, we should maximize pleasure, and when we talk about the net pleasure, we mean the amount of pleasure we create minus any suffering we create. Okay, so you need to know that Ewing identifies utilitarianism with universalistic hedonism. That's just a definitional point. In other words, he identifies utilitarianism, and again, he's talking about classical utilitarianism as saying that pleasure is the only thing that is good in itself and that we should maximize the net pleasure. You need to know also that John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham were famous utilitarians, and that Ewing criticizes utilitarianism. At least he spends most of the essay criticizing utilitarianism, and especially as a guide to action for ordinary people in everyday circumstances. You need to know, as I've said, that Ewing spends most of the essay criticizing the belief that classical utilitarianism should be the ethical guide for ordinary people in everyday circumstances. Ewing does, however, near the end of his essay, argue that because utilitarianism is concerned with increasing the general happiness and reducing collective suffering, it should be one of the major standards for creating and judging laws, public policy, and forms of government. Okay? Now, let's analyze this. So Ewing says, I don't want everyday people, such as parents, such as everyday business people, always to think as utilitarian. Because if a parent, for example, a father, always thinks like a utilitarian, then it could be the father could end up ignoring his or her own, his children rather, his father, and for the sake of someone else. For example, suppose some father used his the money he had saved for his son's education and said, you know what, I can do more good if I just give to this charity and ignore my son's college education. Well, he says, well, that may be true that he could do more good if he didn't help his son at all compared to how much good he could do by helping strangers, but that doesn't automatically mean it's right. I mean, let me give you a better example, and this illustrates Ewing's point. Suppose some father can save his child because his father is on the shore of some beach. His child is drowning, but so are drowning two other persons, let's say, two other young children. And let's suppose the father can save either his own child or the two children who are strangers. And let's suppose furthermore that he could create more happiness in the world, create more pleasure if he saved the strangers and neglected his own son. It's pretty clear to me that Ewing would say he has a special moral obligation to his own son, even if that means he's not maximizing pleasure. So one of Ewing's points is that doing the right thing will sometimes require us to do something other than maximizing pleasure. But here's the other side. Ewing says that while ordinary people in everyday circumstances should not automatically and always think as utilitarians, politicians, public bureaucrats, people creating various public regulations and laws and forms of government should to some degree think as utilitarians. Now why? Because utilitarianism is concerned with the collective happiness and reducing collective unhappiness. And so then Ewing says, look, if you have some public policy that or some regulations that clearly do much more harm than good, create much more suffering than pleasure, then those are very powerful strikes against it. If you have some, let's say, form of government, whether it's Nazism or Soviet communism or some other form of totalitarianism, that creates misery, much more misery than happiness, then he says that gives you strong reason for condemning that form of government. Okay? So I want you to know that although Ewing spends most of his time criticizing utilitarianism, especially as a guide to ordinary people in everyday circumstances, he does think that it should be one of the major standards used for creating and judging laws, public policies, and forms of government. Okay, why does Ewing think that utilitarianism is more plausible for politics and public policy than for private citizens? Well, because, okay, I should, by the way, I made a mistake. I should have said because Ewing. It says because Rachel's. I need to change that. Because Rachel's, the question is, it should say Ewing. Why does Ewing believe that utilitarianism is more plausible for politics and public policy than for private citizens? Because Ewing believes that politics is or should be concerned with collective happiness. It is appropriate for politicians to make decisions partly on utilitarian grounds. Why does he, meaning Ewing, think that utilitarianism will be required to approve of an intolerable degree of dishonesty? Well, that's because Ewing thinks that, let's say, a poor person may be inclined to cheat a wealthier by appealing to utilitarianism, and that people who constantly think about the relative benefits of lying versus telling the truth may lie much more often than they should. Okay? So again, Ewing thinks that you should almost automatically be honest, but you may not be if you constantly try to weigh what you're doing and judge it according to what at a given time will produce more pleasure or happiness. Now also, you simply need to know that for Ewing, certain activities such as the pursuit of truth and beauty are valuable apart from the pleasure they produce. And just know that fact. Just know that fact. Know that for Ewing, he says classical utilitarianism is deficient. Why? Because classical utilitarianism says that pleasure is the only thing good in and of itself, and the value of something is only in relation to the pleasure. So Ewing says we do value the pursuit of truth and beauty simply because of the sorts of activities they are, and not in direct ratio to how much pleasure they produce. And you need to know that fact. Ewing is disputing the belief of classical utilitarianism that pleasure is the only thing good in and of itself. Okay, I want you to know all that I've talked about. You can easily replay this several times. You can take further notes on it. You can create flashcards from it. But I suggest looking at this repeatedly, thinking about it, taking notes on it, and talking about it with someone else. And some people say even lecturing the stuffed animals can have some value. So in other words, just paraphrasing it, trying to understand it, creating flashcards for it, all of that can be extremely beneficial. So this concludes the review for the third test. The third test for many of you will be the most difficult one. It covers many different concepts, many different philosophers. So you definitely want to study it very closely, and you want to study this lecture and listen to the lecture very, very closely. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to email me. And if you want to talk, you want to create a phone conference, we can easily do that as well. Good luck. Again, this concludes this particular lecture. There is one error that I noticed under Ewing, and it says why he thinks utilitarianism is more plausible in politics and public policy than for private citizens. And then I say because it says Rachel's, I should have said because Ewing, not Rachel's, believes that politics is or should be concerned with collective happiness. It is appropriate for politicians to make decisions partly on utilitarian grounds. Again, this concludes this lecture.